nature and nurture is a fundamental question in psychology, even more fundamental for this course. In a course that's attempting to look at the biology of psychology, we have to stop and ask ourselves, really, to what degree does biology affect us? Right? Do our genes and our biological functions truly control and dictate our behavior and our thoughts, or is it more about our nurture, our experiences? Right? So we're talking about the nature versus nurture dynamic. What we're talking about with nature is what we've been discussing, our genetics, our DNA, those innate, inherited biological functions that define our phenotype. What we are saying is that behavior and mental processes are a phenotype of our genetics. When we're talking about nurture, we're talking about those experiences we've had throughout our whole entire life, from within the womb and exposure to different foods and chemicals and stressors, all the way through birth, through growing up as a child, becoming an adult, and all of those experiences that culminate in defining who we are as a person. How much of who we are is defined by that biology, by that genetics, versus this experience of life is what encapsulates this debate. So, as scientists, our question is, how can we design an experiment to test this idea scientifically that nature has a dramatic effect on us, or that nurture has a more dramatic effect? So if you think about this, we have to find a way of holding the environment as constant as possible while varying the genetics, or find a way of keeping the genetics common while varying the environment. So under what circumstances can we look at human beings who have identical genetics? Well, twin studies. In particular, what we're looking at is identical twins versus fraternal twins. The question is, are identical twins more similar to each other than fraternal twins? Right? If the behavior is genetic, we should see a stronger connection between identical twins, which share all their genes, than fraternal twins, which only share half. And one of the largest studies that looked at whether or not identical twins had more in common came out of Minnesota, or the Minnesota Twin Study. They looked at a series of personality traits, which is very relevant to us as psychologists, to see if they were more similar between identical twins than fraternal twins. To what degree could similar genetics account for similarity of these traits? Right? The more genetics could account for the similarity of the traits, the more strongly they could be tied to genetics. So here was a list of a series of personality traits that they looked at. Absorption and imagination is the tendency to sort of be lost in the clouds, to be internally focused, to have a vivid imagination. Neuroticism is emotional stability. Aggression is a tendency to show aggression. Sense of alienation is how connected to society and family you feel. Traditionalism is how much you value tradition in your family and culture. Social potency is a form of extroversion. How open are you socially? How much do you like to interact with other people? Inhibition control is about controlling our impulses. Sense of well-being is optimism. Low risk-taking is about managing risks in your behavior. Achievement orientation is a focus on goals, while social closeness is about preference for openly expressed intimacy in relationships. And so all of these traits were looked at in twins to see whether or not nurture contributed more or nature. So think about all of these different traits, pause the video, and actually rank these in order of what you think is most likely to be predominantly nature to what you think is most likely to be predominantly nurture. Pause the video and let's take a look. So what we're seeing is the percentage of the trait that could be accounted for by genetics. All right, so if we look down at the bottom, we see that absorption or imagination trait, over 75% of the variance in that trait could be accounted for by genetics alone. All right? Anything in the 40 to 50% range likely means that genetics is playing the predominant role in defining that personality trait. And you see almost all of these traits show really strong genetic contribution. Right? It's really only a handful of traits, that seem to show nurture as the dominant force. This is evidence to suggest that biology can have a substantial impact on our psychology. In fact, there's a wide range of behaviors that we can show genetics playing a substantial role. For example, alcohol consumption and tobacco smoking has been shown to have almost a 60% heritability index, a strong link between one's genetics and one's likelihood to consume alcohol or smoke tobacco. In fact, sometimes something as simple as dog ownership can show substantial heritability. With almost a 50% heritability index, the likelihood of whether you own a dog or not shows substantial genetic involvement. Twin studies are not the only techniques that we can use. Adoption studies have also been successful. Well, how could we use adoption? Well, in the cases where the birth parents are known, but there has not been substantial contact between the adopted child and the birth family, one can look at personality traits of the adopted child and compare them to the adopted family versus the birth family. When doing so, you tend to find that a lot of traits are often more correlated with the birth family than the adopted family. But that's not true of all traits. Traits that are centered around values tend to show a tighter association with the adoptive family. These include things like political beliefs, religious beliefs, and certain expectations of behavior. These values-based beliefs do show a much stronger nurture effect. Overall, there is substantial evidence that our biology can have a major effect on our psychology. That means that nature matters. But as we talked about, inheritance is not just the process of getting biological information from your parents, but also it's a discussion of how that biological information has been shaped historically across the evolution of our species. Since we know that genetics can play a substantial role in the way we act and think, then we hypothesize within psychology that our behavior and our thoughts have likely been shaped by evolutionary processes. And that's going to be the subject of the next set of videos.